Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jen Hicks. I'm the Director of Communications and Outreach with Maine Woodland Owners. We're a nonprofit organization based in Augusta. We're a membership organization. We have close to 2,500 members with a monthly newsletter and a very strong, intact community. We provide resources and expertise to small woodland owners in Maine. Today's program is Fireside Forestry with Bob Seymour. It's a silviculture Q&A, and it's presented in a way where it's a bit like car talk, where you come in with questions and you get some great answers and maybe some discussion based on those questions. Bob Seymour is retired from the University of Maine School of Forest Resources faculty after 30 years as the Curtis Hutchins Professor of Silviculture. But much more important, he is our monthly columnist in our newsletter for Practical Silviculture. So he is a very important person in our world. So grateful that he's willing to be a periodic online program leader for our virtual programming that we do in the winter months during this time of COVID. We will be getting back into the woods very soon, and I'm hoping I can get Jessica, his better half, Jessica Leahy's here, his wife, his partner and business partner with their forests in Maine that they own, and hopefully they will be willing to hold some field programs this summer at some of their woods that they own. And Jessica, I'm hoping you'll jump in here and there in some of these questions. But I don't have much more to say other than if you're not a member, please become a member. Go to our website, mainewoodlandowners.org. You'll find information. I'm also the editor of the newsletter. So a lot of times we like to get questions, thoughts, topics from our members to develop some newsletter articles. So please reach out to me, Jen at mainewoodlandowners.org. I'll repeat all this at the end. Without any further ado, I'm going to pass this over to you, Bob.
Okay.
All right, the show is yours.
I want to correct something you said in the intro. It's actually much more important to me that I'm retired rather than writing this column. If I weren't retired, I couldn't do that second. So, and I imagine Jess feels the same way. So, but I do very much enjoy writing the column. I look forward to it every month. And anyway. So
I will say, I'm sorry, I'm going to jump in. If anybody wants to jump in with their questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand, turn on your video, raise your hand. I'll try to catch you and acknowledge you. Questions in the chat box, I'm going to keep an eye on, and I'll point them out to you, Bob, so you can respond to those. Okay.
Bob actually had this week, he was flying drones over our woodlot in Bucksport with Tom Dodd, and they were talking about how what was that quote, Bob? How you ever had time to work? You don't recall, given how busy everyone is in retirement.
Yeah, that was from Tom's father, right? Yeah, that's right. That's the way I feel. So that's good. So, well, whoever, just fire away. Whoever wants to go first. I don't
see. I'm not seeing anybody yet, but go ahead, John.
Oh, John's got one.
Thank you, Bob and Jessica, for your many contributions already that I've seen and read in the newsletter. I've enjoyed the work that you've done and what you put in there. I think we have a common friend in Mac Hunter, perhaps. If you ever want to know the dirt on his youth, I'll let you know.
You grew up with Mac or went to college with him, or?
We were in college together, and then we roomed together in a building that's long since been torn down, as dilapidated.
Yeah. Well, you actually, as it just so happens, Mac will be featured in my upcoming newsletter column, among other people. Good. So you will read all about him. He and I go way back. Yeah. So nothing surprises me about him. So anyway, go ahead with your question.
So I'm curious. I've got a band of sugar maples, and in amongst it is a lot of beech. So I've been picking away at the beech and getting that out of there. And this question is partly about sugar maple, but it could be broader to white pine, oak, et cetera. And it's just a matter of spacing and the evolution of the spacing, so that when you've got a younger forest, if you will, I'm reluctant to clear everything out to, you know, the spacing that might be suggested at an older age, just because things die, it seems like, and I hedge my bets in the wrong direction, perhaps. But I was curious, I guess, what your thoughts were on spacing and the evolution of that over time. And then the other question was, in those instances where, you know, I'm coming into the managing the woods after it's been neglected for a long, long time, and I've got trees that, you know, I have multiple main significant stems coming out of the ground, 2 or 3, and my temptation is to take the best one and leave it and cut the others out. And I don't know whether that in the long run, you know, undermines the one that's left standing, and I'd be better off just to let it be.
These are great questions. So I need to know how tall or how old your sugar maple is.
Well, the sugar maple that I've got ranges from probably over 100 years to 10 years. So it's a nice range in there, and I'd like to keep that.
Sure. Okay. Have you been harvesting, picking away at this stand with commercial harvests, or?
Nope, doing it all myself. I'm 70, and I'm not sure how many more years I can keep doing this, but I've been selling off the beech for firewood, and I just put out a load of pulpwood poplar.
Okay, so you've been doing, you know, just basically what we call, I guess, improvement cuttings, right? Improving the species mix. Weeding, yes, yeah. Although if you're weeding, we tend to use, that's a silvicultural term, only for like sapling stands, young trees. Weeding in older stands is more improvement cutting, because you're actually harvesting stuff. But anyway, it is weeding though, because you're favoring certain species over others. I think there's a lot of answers to this. A thinning like this can be very quantitative, or it can be pretty simple. I think the way I've tried to make it simple for folks is using a concept, which I think I've written about a bit and perhaps should revisit, is making the spacing between trees a fraction of their heights. It's an old method devised by a guy named Frederick Wilson in Wisconsin. He sort of worked out regimes for red pine. I've learned it's used for Chad Oliver when he was at University of Washington, tried to promote that for Douglas fir, and it's widely used in Europe as a method for Norway spruce. So it works really well with conifers because they have a very tight crown architecture or geometry. So if you think about it, the taller a tree, if you let the crown expand as it grows upward, the wider the crown. So what we really have then is the height growth is a surrogate for the crown expansion. They're very highly coupled. So that's why the spacing height rule, if you have a rule, works almost at any stage. So if you were thinning like a spruce plantation or something, a narrow crown tolerant conifer for production, you'd use something like 0.25, a quarter. In other words, space the trees a quarter of their height. But for hardwoods, which have much wider crowns at a given diameter, you would want it, and white pine even, I've promoted a spacing height fraction, they're called, of almost as high as 50%. So it's self-correcting, right? So if you got 40 feet tall trees and you really want to produce valuable crop trees, then thinning, you know, up to 20 feet apart will look open at the time, but that will quickly, of course, because the spacing doesn't change, but the height grows, that fraction goes down, right? So you thin to that, and then you thin to say 0.5, thin to measure your heights, or just eyeball them, right? You can just eyeball this. That's the beauty of this. Okay, I'm going to thin. I look up in my tree. I'm going to take everything within half of its height away, right? That's in the crown. You don't have to thin. So the only thing that matters are the trees that are in the main canopy, right? the trees that are down in what we call the lower stratum, the mid-story and the understory, aren't really here, at least, competing with those crop trees. So what you're only really doing, what this would silviculture be called crown thinning, which is thinning from above, where you're thinning in the canopy, right, to try to create open space. And so those crowns will expand. So it's classic crop tree approach. And the question is, most landowners that have not studied silviculture or have this kind of background never thin anywhere near heavily enough, is my sense. Now that's one thing about it. So something like if you're a little conservative, maybe use 0.4 for 40% of the height, somewhere in that zone, 40 to 50% of the height of the trees for most hardwoods and white pine will work. Jess and I did a crop tree release on about 5 acres or so ash. It was about 40 feet tall and we went 20 feet apart. Man, we probably cut 90+% of the trees. I mean, literally down. It was a very thick stand. We got 3 years of firewood out of that. We're now just run through about the last stick of it this winter. It's been cold. And that stand has just exploded. I mean, it really is literally, I couldn't believe the sprouts of those ash trees. They're about 40 years old, right? And they were very crowded. And so let me address there's just one issue with thinning that heavily though. If you say you do this with red oak or yellow birch, and you cut down literally everything, and the boles now, the trunks are exposed to the sunlight, you can get epicormic sprouts forming on the bole, epicormic branching, right? The dormant buds, they're in the cambial layer actually, the tree gets sort of temporarily stressed because it's used to growing in the shade, and all of a sudden it's exposed. Those buds can break and form epicormics. Sugar maple is pretty good about that. You probably wouldn't have much of a problem. The better way around that though, is to leave, if you have them, what we call trainers. Trainers are trees in the mid-story, shade tolerant trees. In this case, this could be your beech, right? So if you have a maple tree that's 40 feet tall and you have a beech tree that's 25 feet tall, say next to that maple, cutting that beech does nothing for that maple. In fact, it could harm it if you're going to release that maple. So you release the maple in the main canopy, probably by cutting other maples or aspen or other things that are up there, fast growing hardwoods, paper birch, those kinds of species. But the stuff down in the mid-story is actually helping you, at least if it's nearby and shading the tree. Now, in the long run, that mid-story, understory will interfere with regeneration. So we don't want the beech to just build up wantonly in the understory either. So when we're doing our beech control work with our backpack chainsaw, and I'm cutting these beeches, and every now and then I'll hear Jess, she'll scream trainer at me, which when I'm about to cut these trainers, right? Because I'm just cutting beech. I'm not really looking at the spacing. So this happens to everybody. So you might want to actually even mark these, not only your crop trees with ribbon or something, mark the trainers to leave nearby. You can still cut many of the understory, mid-story beech, but leaving the few near the boles of the crop tree. Hemlock is perfect for this, even fir. Anything that's shade tolerant and much shorter is a good thing to leave next to your hardwood crop trees up in the main canopy. You wouldn't need to do this, of course, for white pine because pine doesn't form those epicormics mostly. The old trees sometimes do, but it's not a factor. The final thing you asked about was whether to thin sprout clumps to a single stem. The answer to that is, if that's all you have, yes. I mean, obviously favor single stems over clumps if you have plenty of single stems that are healthy. But we routinely cut the red maple and older red oaks back to a single stem. Even in commercial harvest, we've done that routinely. That article of a couple of months ago showed an example of that. Red oaks, like 12-inch red oak, right? 3 of them coming off the stump, cut 2 of them, leave the best, pick the straightest tree, and if you have a choice, the lowest origin one, the ones that originate lowest on the root system of the parent tree, not ones that look like they're sticking up that came off the top of an old stump. And then because of the phenomenon that I've written about of compartmentalization of the fungi, the tree that you leave will tend to wall off any infection from the roots. So the other stumps will just rot away, and unless that's a very high origin sprout that you're leaving or may have damage or some reason, it's probably going to be free of defects. So all that's a good thing to do. Absolutely do that. The sooner you do it, the better, right? If you do it when the trees are 1 inch, that's great, right? Just cut them down, leave a high stump, just whack them off. Don't use, this is a case where you can't use a herbicide, because if you do, you're going to kill the residual tree too, right? You kill the whole root system. So don't do that. Just cut them off. And the one you leave, the residual stem will inhibit the sprouting of the others. So you're good to go there. Jess, you wanted to say something?
Oh, yeah. Well, you naturally segued into it. There was a question in the chat from Mike about, would you do this ratio with yellow birch? And just like 30 seconds after that got posted, you, without even seeing it, you started to talk about the epicormics and what you would do there.
Right, that's right. So the ideal situation is to do the same, open them up, but then leave the trainers. Yellow birch is probably, of all hardwoods, would be the most sensitive, and also red oak. Red oak, although leaving very dominant trees. So the other thing that controls epicormic sprouting is how dominant the tree was before it was released. The more dominant, the more likely it is to not sprout. If you're trying to release like spindly intermediate crown class trees or ones that are weak, those are guaranteed. That's a stress reaction, right? The tree's trying to reform a crown, thinking it's usually a stress reaction to like insect defoliation. Like if you have a bad gypsy moth defoliation on your oak, after a couple of years, the only ability that tree has to form a new crown is from epicormic buds in the cambial layer. So it's a last ditch stress reaction to keep the tree alive. So but it also happens in, if you thin heavily in a crop tree fashion in hardwood. So leave the trainers if you can.
Awesome. Well, there's also a different topic posted into the chat from Dennis Cunningham. He has 40 acres in Surrey, and he would like to hear a few words from you about the concept of pro-forestation. He heard it in a radio interview, a concept to encouraging, well, what Dennis heard on the radio interview was that it's a concept to encourage leaving big trees because of their incredible contribution to carbon sequestration, and that you could pay forest owners not to harvest.
Wow, this is probably the issue, right? I've alluded to this in the article too. And I'll just say right at the start, I can understand both sides of this, and it tears me apart myself as a woodlot owner and as a forester and as somebody that really cares about human civilization and the climate, right? So the idea of pro-forestation is that by simply stopping harvesting is the very best thing we can do to instantly sequester more carbon from the atmosphere in our forests. Scientifically, it's hard to argue with that, right? Because every time we cut, as I've written, every time you cut a tree, there's no thin stand. If you thin a stand, you're not going to grow as much or wood or sequester as much carbon as if you not thinned it. That's if you measure everything, right? Down to the smallest tree, every atom of carbon. Now, of course, we do thinning for economic reasons to get higher values of commercial products. But I don't think any scientist can argue that that you can do that and also maximize carbon storage. They are to some degree in conflict. And a good example of this, and Tom, is Tom on the call? If Tom, I hope not, because he was on the governor's task force and he had nothing to do with this. But we just had Governor Mills had a task force, right? That Tom Doak and many others served on. And right at the start, they took off the table pro-forestation as a remedy. That was not discussed, right? The idea of not harvesting, right? Or even reducing harvesting. The guy Muma, the guy that promotes this, is he just wants to put everything in a big giant reserve and shut down the industry. Now that, of course, everybody on the screen that owns woodlands, we'd immediately, that'd be horrible. Our land would be worthless economically if that happened. So I'm certainly not in favor of this. However, it doesn't serve to try to argue that we can have our cake and eat it too. So that's what the governor's task force did. They tried to find a way to sequester more carbon without reducing the harvest in Maine by 1 cord. And that is a very difficult challenge. And the recommendations in the end were good things for forest owners, but they're not going to have much of any immediate impact on the climate, right? So there are lots of long run things we can do to sequester more carbon, right? By growing trees on longer rotations, all of the things that I promote is ecological forestry and just good timber production forestry. Grow them large. They're still growing very well. They're worth more money. Have an industry that uses more of the large trees. All of those things are good things to aspire to in the long run, but they don't do much in the short run, right? Ironically, I mean, one of the practices that Adam Daigneault, our forest economist at Maine, did a big simulation study of this. And the two things that he found that really moved the needle on carbon in Maine were, one, reducing harvesting and put land in reserves, and two, in the long run, growing a lot more area in high yield conifer plantations. What that does is that it ends up, now this is somewhat ironic because some of those are not necessarily long rotation. This is like a la J.D. Irving, right, in northern Maine. What that does is in the long run, that boosts the growth. I mean, if we're going to actually keep the same industry and not reduce harvest, we have to increase growth, right? So we have to harvest the same, but do things that increase growth. Now, we can do all kinds of things like that, but they don't show up in the short run very much. They show up big time in the long run. And I think many of people on the screen here probably are already doing these things, or at least trying to. And so that's what pro-forestation is. There is, of course, this NCX new program that many of you may have heard about. It's it's a program to pay you significant money for not harvesting at all on your land for 1 year. That's all. That's all you got to do. We're not going to cut any trees on our land for 1 year. You sign up and you may get $10 an acre. I mean, that's an average figure that I've heard. And initially, when I heard about this, and I'm on the Maine Woodland Owners Carbon Committee, Maine Woodland Owners is considering doing this. And actually, I think the board has agreed to test the waters on this program. Interestingly, there's a principle of leakage, there's additionality, leakage. There are these principles of carbon, right, and sequestration. And of course, if you look at the data, 97% of Maine's forests, well, put it this way, 3% of Maine's forest land is harvested every year, 3%. So you could pay 97% of Maine's owners not to harvest 1 year, those that weren't going to do it anyway, lots and lots of money, and it would not have one iota of benefit to the carbon, the atmosphere above the state of Maine or in the United States or North America or anywhere. Now, if you get those 3% that we're going to cut to back off, then now you've actually accomplished something. And they will tell you right up in their literature that this is that the big players, this is the voluntary carbon market, like Microsoft and British Petroleum. They don't like, I mean, they're enrolled somewhat in these long-term programs where you have to sign 20, 50-year contracts and very rigorous monitoring. This program has none of this, right? But stopping harvesting, the pro-forestation idea that's been popularized by guys like Mumad, that it actually does make a difference if we all did that, right? It would actually benefit the atmosphere. So that's what Microsoft wants to show. So this to me is both interesting and also a little scary if you take it to the extreme, right? I mean, if we all stopped harvesting, we would no longer have markets for our products. So procurement foresters in Maine must be just beside themselves over this program, because they have a significant competitor. And so a slight amount of this I think is good. Some people say this is actually the best thing that's ever happened to forest markets, because if the pulpwood buyers are going to have to start paying another $2 a ton to get your pulpwood, just because they have to convince people to harvest that wouldn't have otherwise, then that to me is a good thing for us. Right. And we can also sign up for these carbon programs. After being very skeptical of this in principle, I finally decided to try to enroll all of our lands. They want you to enroll all of our lands. We own 490 acres now in 8 different properties. So I contacted them 2 weeks ago And we are in the process now of getting a proposal from them. There's no guarantee we will follow through on it, but somebody, Mac Hunter, I know is involved with this. He's taking advantage of this because he just bought a bunch of land and put it in a forever wild conservation easement. And now he's going to get paid $15, I don't know what it is, something like that, an acre for having done that a year. I mean, our lands, I measure our lands, right? We have permanent plots. I look at the growth and I look at the value of that growth. Our best lands are making maybe $30 or $40 an acre a year. 25 is a good average. So if somebody's going to pay, that's by cutting the trees on them, right? And capturing that growth for sawlogs and high value products. If somebody's going to pay you $10 or $15 for doing nothing, the market's going to react to that. So, and there's just tons and tons of money. If you go to NCX's website, they've got projects all over the country. And we're doing this partly so I can we can both become informed about it. And because I have this pulpit, right, I can write then about it and explain our experience and see how I feel about it. I may end up I know a couple foresters that investigated and it's like, no, we're not going to do this. There may be an issue like if you do this, does that prevent you from going into the more rigorous carbon programs? That's possible. I'm not sure. But that's probably too long an answer on pro-forestation, but it is the issue right now before woodlanders is, being paid not to harvest your trees not for 30 years. If you're going to do it for 30 years, that would be a significant, gesture and would have a big impact on the climate and also a huge negative impact on the market. And our value of our land probably and our growing stuff. But so that is the dilemma, to make a difference in the short run, there's not a lot we can do in forestry short of stop cutting half of the trees that we do every year, and therefore not having the forest products that displace, right, cement and concrete and all the other nasty things that have a huge, much higher carbon footprint than wood. So when you look the life cycle in there, it doesn't get so simple. And most of the criticism of the pro-forestation is about the fact that, taken to the extreme, we would lose our best building material, our greenest product that is renewable and sustainable. So it's very complicated, both politically and even scientifically. So there. Ross, what do you got on your mind today? Go ahead.
Well, changing directions here.
Yeah, let's get off of that one. That's enough of them.
I just completed a 70-acre harvest on my property, and it's the first time I harvested any significant amounts of hemlock. I was surprised at how poor quality the hemlock was. And in the truckload of hemlock, 13 cords, there was maybe 2 cords of saw material, and the rest was just junk. It went for pulp. Is it normal? Is hemlock just a normally poor quality tree like red maple, or is this specific to my situation and site?
And Bob, I want to add my own. I'd like your thoughts. Hemlock's known for having shake and splitting around the ring. So
right,
while you're answering Ross's question, if you could throw in a little tutorial on shake, I would actually benefit from it.
So hemlock as a tree species, I love hemlock. Of course, here it's to some degree in southern Maine threatened and even being killed by the hemlock adelgid, right? So it has a pest problem. But apart from that, there's a belt in Maine. I don't actually know much about hemlock in the Lake States. I know it's native there and probably well suited ecologically there. But there's a belt here, like the Penobscot Experimental Forest, which is just across the river. I can almost see it out my window here in Orono. It's got some beautiful hemlock. So hemlock saw logs that are, say, 80 to 100 years old and have grown steadily. They're not old growth remnant old growth trees. The trees in the PEF, for example, originated in the late 1800s after probably, tan bark cuttings, because hemlock was used widely for bark, right, to tan leather during that period. I'm not sure if there was an industry in the Lake States that did that, but it was, that was common here. Then they went to chemical tans, right, after they cut all the old growth hemlock. But Also, that was the peak of spruce logging. So regenerated, there's a belt in Maine, at the southern end of the spruce fir forest, sort of north, in the borderline area, the settled parts of Maine, where hemlock really mixes in, and well, we actually have come to call it a northern conifer forest rather than a spruce fir forest because it has a lot of hemlock. And that hemlock, if it's not, is generally quite good. There were hemlock, there was a big hemlock stud mill run by Diamond up in Passadumkeag that ran for years, finally burned down about 2005. There was a Stillwater lumber mill over just across the river here that operated for years, but they bought hemlock saw logs. I would get, I added where I'm sitting here, an addition on our home I built in 1999. It's all framed with hemlock 2x6s. I'd buy a lift of hemlock of 16-foot 2x6s. And I mean, there were, I don't know how many pieces, there'd be what, 100 boards in there. 20 of them would be absolutely clear and just beautiful stuff. And I saved those. I stickered them and dried them, and I've used them to make doors and everything else. So hemlock can be valuable. The problem with hemlock, but in the stumpage price, we just sold a bunch of hemlock in the timber sale I just wrote about in the last issue, right? We had this big issue. I cut these big hemlock or not. Prices have gone up, and we had a market for hemlock, long hemlock logs above 16, so 18, 20, 22, 24s to an 8-inch top, which hemlock usually sells here. You have to have a 10-inch top. The biggest eastern hemlock sawmill in the world is in Bradford, about 20 miles from here. So there is an industry based on hemlock. The problem with hemlock, but the hemlock stumpage price for even those long logs, we got $100 a thousand stumpage, which I thought was a good price. Typically you get $80 a thousand for hemlock, 10 inches and bigger saw logs. And they don't want 8-footers, right? You got to have at least 12s. Spruce rather is going to be 150, 200. So it's like worth twice as much. Pine, the same thing. So why is the question is, okay, if it's such a good wood, and it is stronger than spruce, right? It's a nice building material. Why no market? The reason is because hemlock, carpenters, if you've ever built with it, you have to use it green. Once it dries, it splits just terribly. So with modern tools, right, you can screw it or you can use nail guns. It isn't as bad as it used to be, but it's got a bad reputation from builders once it's dry. So you have to ship it, you have to build with it green. So all this stuff I was talking about, I use green. Nail it right up, right? And then the house, it just creaks, and you have to allow for settling and everything else, but you get a really nice structure for much cheaper that way. But because you can't kiln dry it and sell it in the market, you can therefore not ship it any distance on a truck, right? So you're shipping, like if you got, I don't know how many board feet go on to a loaded tractor trailer of kiln dried spruce, but if with that same weight would be only half the number of board feet of hemlock. So you just can't compete in markets, right? So that's why hemlock is if you're lucky to live in an area like Maine and maybe Wisconsin, if you have mills that saw local use hemlock. It's the classic local use species. The shake thing, now you're also lucky to be able to sell hemlock as pulpwood. We actually, until the Old Town mill reopened a couple years ago here, we couldn't even sell it for maybe, geez, almost a decade there. You could maybe get rid of a little bit of it, but now that's mostly what they're using. So we were able to market all the hemlock pulpwood from this timber sale off of the top of the sawlog trees, and even do some thinning in the hemlock. I mean, it's not a high value product, right? It's a couple of dollars. What did we get? $150, 1,000 pounds, $3 a ton. So that's, a truckload of that's what, maybe $30 or $40. But at least you're being paid for it. And if you're marking the trees and doing improvement cutting, thinning, then at least you're making a little bit of money and you don't have to make investments. The ring shake thing, the hemlock is prone to ring shake. Ring shake is where the wood separates around the growth rate. And this is thought to come from trees wind swaying in the wind, or when you're very open. I think more commonly it's from trees, hemlock being probably the most shade tolerant species we have, maybe also with cedar, but can grow extremely slowly. And then you release a sapling and it just explodes, right? You go from tiny micro rings to like 2 rings an inch in a few years. If that tree is like 4 or 5 inches when it's released like that, that abrupt change in growth can form a discontinuity in the ring, where ring shake that happens later on. I think after those rings are technically biologically dead. Of course, remember only the outside of the tree is alive. But that can happen. But these second growth hemlock that I'm talking about here are actually really, pretty high quality as wood. It's just that they're not. You wouldn't make lots of money growing them on your woodlot. And that's probably always going to be true. Hemlock's never going to be able to compete it's always been this sort of second-rate wood. Maine took out right here in this Penobscot River across the street from us, 2 dams that were built in the 1800s. So one down in Vesey was built in 1840. They could have built that out of anything they wanted, giant pine saw logs. It turned out when they dismantled that, the whole thing was built out of hemlock, right? It's always been the second class wood, right? They had back in the 1840, they had plenty of big old virgin pine floating down the river, nice spruce, everything else. The hemlock got used for the dams and other, barns, other sort of second rate products that they couldn't market or sell into the general economy. So that's hemlock. If you have ecologically, it fills a niche. I think in wildlife, it forms that nice mid-story in your stand. It is the perfect trainer tree for your hardwood crop trees. If you have pure stands of it, that would be rare, I would think. Ross, is these stands pure as this hemlock mixed in with hardwood? What's the composition of these hemlock stands?
It's mixed in with yellow birch, cedar, and red maple.
Yeah, well, don't overdo it then. I would keep some of that in there as trainers to keep the quality, especially of your yellow birch and red maple. By the way, I like red maple. I've grown to like red maple. We used to think red maple is a weed. And on really high sites, where you can grow good sugar maple, it's you should favor the sugar. But red maple now, I think it has good markets. It's almost used interchangeably with hard maple now in some of the trades. You can tell the difference, but it goes for a high price if it's clear. And you can grow it fast on just a wide variety of sites. It has no pests, really, to speak of. It regenerates easily, and it's taking over the eastern hardwood forest partly because of in the oak areas because of lack of historical fire in those stands. That's not an issue up here, but I tend to like our red maple. And the other thing that's driving that is the emerald ash borer. Usually on these old field hardwood stands here in this part of Maine, they'll have a lot of ash and red maple. We used to just routinely favor the ash and cut the red maple. That was just, we didn't even think about it. And now when we were doing this crop tree work, it was just the other way around. Ron Locke, the previous forester who owned this land, had, I think, weeded out a lot of the red maple, right? We had this pure overstock stand of almost pure ash. It was amazing in that sense. But now we're stuck with this is the cost of putting all your eggs in one basket from the biodiversity standpoint. So wherever we had a maple, occasional red maple, even occasional sugar maple lurking in the mid-story, we left it, didn't we? We sort of sought out the maples. But even still, we have, maybe 10% in the residuals crop tree stand of maple, still 90% ash. So, yeah.
I do have to, one thing that it makes me think of, what Ross here is zooming in from Wisconsin, and it's hard to talk about trees across regions because my cousin lived in Spring Green, Wisconsin for a little bit. And when I went to visit him, I actually was struggling with tree ID, even of trees that we have here in Maine, because they grow differently in different, different regions and different climates and everything. And, I also hear colleagues complaining about sugar maple in the southern reaches, and the sugar maple does not, we have sugar maple grows beautifully here in Maine frequently, but as it gets to its southern region, Bob would be able to articulate more about why it takes on different form, different morphology, I guess. And then Bob, when you're ready, there's a new chat when you're done.
Oh, David Foster's hemlock book. You're commenting?
Yep, and then and Vincent's has posted a couple of things about permaculture and food forests and the combination, sort of a silvopasture, or people. We've had requests with our sugar maple research on could you do mushroom logs in your sugar bush to sort of extend the season and the products coming out? So do you have comments to say about permaculture?
I'm not, I know very little about it, to be honest. It's not something that motivates me. But I think I love the concept of it. I mean, I think if this is, it's a different lens that you look at your forest. I'm always, it's hard for me to get out of the old forester mode of thinking of sawlogs, right, and forest products, as well as ecosystem values, right? But growing other things. I mean, I think my one general comment would be that the kind of crop tree management that you would use to grow sawlogs strikes me as being also a good practices for growing things in the understory, because they need resources. They need probably some light, diffuse light. The rotting wood that you would drop on the forest floor from thinning, so you're not harvesting, would seem to be beneficial. So probably is not a big conflict here, as long as you're managing with a light hand, and you could still grow lots of products, right? Just a general comment. I've been having a dialogue with several people, and this will come up in my next couple columns about probably the most common question was about how do we rehabilitate a badly hydrated forest, right? And of course, I advise them to get management plans, but then there's this whole thing about management plans. I mean, I'm a forester, I rewrite management plans and they're helpful to us, but there are some people that are reluctant to even get one because, to them, it translates into, oh, that means we got to have a harvest. The forester's going to do it, right? They're going to want us to cut some trees, and we just don't want to do that. We'd love to learn more about our land, but we don't want to be harvesting. So there's an identity problem that foresters have here. It's somewhat self-inflicted, as I've written, but I think it's also somewhat undeserved, right? Depends on the forester. Foresters are a diverse profession. We are the agent of society that turns wood into cash for landowners. And we should be proud of doing that, but that doesn't mean that that's all we do. If the best of us try to do that in a way that keeps the ecosystem functioning really well. And I don't personally see a conflict. I think there's been too many people have had bad experiences with poorly implemented harvesting, where probably there was no forester involved, and have gotten really turned off by it. Legitimately so. And Mac Hunter is a good example of that. Guess why he's putting all of his land in reserves. He's trying to it's his sure way of reversing, centuries of abuse of that land that surrounds him out there in Amherst. So, and it's a free country, so he can do that. And I would never do it. I think we can have both. I think we can sequester a lot. The problem really, I think, is finding the sweet spot where we can still afford to own the land, harvest some high value products that will contribute to displacing concrete and all these things, but also continue to sequester lots of carbon, keep high stocking levels, regenerate diverse forests that will resist climate change, and keep forests out there. I mean, I think it's not an either or, in other words, but I fear that lots of landowners see it that way, and that's unfortunate. And we can only reverse that with a lot of I think good experiences. I think the Maine Woodland Owners Land Trust Program is a good example of how we might do that. We now have 10,000 acres in it. A lot of fairly well managed lands. There's some lands in there that were cut pretty heavily before they were given to us. So anyway, so yes.
Great. Okay, let's go do some soil biology next. So,
oh boy, now
Vincent,
we're stretching the limits here. Okay.
Vincent's asking about added mycology from spent logs in mushroom farming, that added mycology would provide more readily available nutrients from the added microbes. So can you talk about, I think forest soil processes and fungi, things like that? He's also included some links so you could study for next month's Fireside Forestry.
Well, the trees get, so the readily available nutrients, available to what? I mean, available to the permaculture plants that you're trying to grow, but also available to the trees, right? What I don't understand here, and I guess he should comment, is are we talking about adding in species that aren't present? Or are we talking about just encouraging native fungi that are native to the forest floor and forest soil complex? If they're already there, then inputs of down wood would be, to strike me as helpful, because most of them are decomposers, right? I see I'll back up a little bit. This issue people have asked me about this, and I don't actually know if it's a soil phenomenon or not, but I've noticed myself, the old field white spruce, let's just take so we can all picture something, right? That's been in decline all along the Maine coast. Old fields in Aroostook County, a lot of plantations were put in. A lot of them have not thrived, and they're all on old ag land, right? And I think the problem, so the ones on the Maine coast were probably old sheep pastures. Those soils were severely depleted, right? Through probably centuries of grazing and other agricultural practices, right? And in the course of doing that, the native soil flora get wiped out, right? They just don't survive without the tree roots and the other input of leaf litter and all the other things. Now, how long it takes them to return once of course, those lands have gone back into forest, and that's the best thing that happened to them because they're not productive farmland, right? How long that takes that soil to rebuild to a natural state is, I don't know the answer, and I don't think anybody does. I think the only thing you do is just wait, right? Is put trees on it, a diverse mix of conifer and softwood, and hope that those soil fungi return. But I could see if you had mostly old field land that had weird, the trees didn't look sickly or something, that maybe inoculating it with fungal species that are absent from old fields but are present in the wild forest might be helpful. I don't know anybody that's done that. It probably has been done. This gets, of course, at Susan Simard's book, the what's the name of the mother tree? Finding the Mother Tree, where she argues, the trees actually we've known for a long time that trees of the same species rootcraft and do interact with each other. But what she found through her career of research is that through fungal mycelia and mycorrhizal networks in the soil, the trees of different species can interact with each other. Talk to each other. Maybe too strong a term, but they do sense each other's presence and respond in ways that are mutually beneficial, maybe is the best way to put it. And that is a new branch of science. And I don't know anybody in the Northeast that's actually like her, and a forest ecologist, is actively working on that. There are scientists down at the Hubbard Brook Forest Experiment Station in the White Mountains on the Forest Service that are working on some of that I'm not aware of. But there's a lot that we don't appreciate just because we can't see it that's going on below ground. So if you have a land, this is one reason I wrote about a few months ago, researching the history of your land, which you can do, right? If you own typical woodlot in central southern Maine, that was probably a farm at one time, right? It probably was never fully cleared. It might have been. If you just bought the frontage of a property, something was plowed, all right. It might have been all farmed, but there were the lesser productive lands on those properties were probably always wooded. They were a source of firewood and other products, right, that the farmers used. And you can tell from those old censuses of agriculture, and 1880 is the sweet one. It's the data was rich, and it gave the areas in your property by improved, unimproved, woodlot, tilled, pasture, et cetera. So what I would do if I were really concerned about this then is I would go out and you could look, you have then forest soils that were never farmed, right? They may have been heavily exploited for trees, but they were never grazed. Well, some of them probably were even grazed. Cows and sheep, of course, ran in the woods. But completely removing the root system, does change those soils for probably centuries. So having those refugia, maybe for fungi, this is probably the right term of it. David Foster at the Harvard Forest, now retired, made a big deal of this down there in like that area in north central Massachusetts where Quabbin Reservoir is, Peter Sam, where the Harvard Forest is. They went, the Harvard Forest, they tried to find all the original forests there that were never cleared. And there, in that area was probably down to like 25% forested at the peak of deforestation in about there would have been about 1860 probably. And those forests are different, right? The forests there now remaining are different than the ones that pioneered back on the old fields. So there are things we don't appreciate for sure. And Vince, you want to comment further? Go ahead.
Well, actually, Jen and I want to make sure as we're down to, we only have 8 minutes. We want to let the folks who have dialed in, we have a few phone people.
Yeah, okay.
Have a chance, and
Change the
while they're
subject.
unmuting, I'm going to hand off moderator duty to Jen to monitor the chat and help you out, Bob. I've got a 10 o'clock here that I have to leave for, but it was really great to see everyone, Ross, Glenn, Mike, and others. There's a lot of Johns on the call. Maybe I know some of you, but it was great to see everyone, and thank you for attending the Fireside Forestry.
Yeah.
I'll let Jen and Bob take over.
Thank you.
So who's next? We got some time.
Do we have anybody on the phone who'd like to jump in with a question?
Can you hear me?
Yep, go ahead.
Sure.
Okay. A couple comments, Bob. One, I had magnificent white spruce on my property, which started, I'm guessing they were on old agricultural lands that started going back to forests around 1930.
Okay.
And I've been doing my own forestry and all my own harvesting for 48 years here.
Yeah.
And maybe 15 years ago, these white spruce that were over 100 feet tall and in the range of 28 to 32 inches in diameter at the butts,
Wow.
they started blowing over. And
Yeah.
my son, who's been working with me the last 15 years, we would go in and harvest these in the winter, which meant we were mining them out of 4 to 5 feet of snowfall.
Yeah.
What we found out in the as they were blowing over is they had red heart, what looked like red heart in the root systems.
Yeah.
But they were dying from the roots.
Yeah.
And so I think your observation about former pasture land or agricultural land strikes me as quite plausible.
Yeah. Yeah.
We still have quite a few magnificent white spruce that are in the same age category. And where they're doing really well is where they're growing in cedar swamps.
Right. That's exactly the native habitat. They were never, white spruce in the native forest was never a monoculture, right? It grew and scattered in just those places, toe slopes in with fir and cedar, right?
Yep.
Exactly. And then some, incredible tall white spruce grew in those positions. J.D. Irving up in the Black Brook and their limits just across the border, up where in Aroostook County, right across in Van Buren there.
Right.
A white spruce that was 145 feet tall, 4 feet in diameter. This is 30 years ago, right? In a hardwood stand. It stuck up above all the sugar maple, right? That's the way they were, scattered around. And that tree was white as a sheet right to the pith, right? So that because it was in the natural forest. So I think Vern Labby, former forester in Aroostook County, I'm sure you know Vern, forester for the Bureau of Parks and Land for much of his career, now just wrote to me about this. And he says he's seeing these white spruce plantations all sort of in decline all over the place, but only on these old ag lands, right?
Right, I noticed that as well.
The problem is the other thing they might just be running out of nutrients too. If you have very fertile and rich sites, that's the white spruce and those toe slopes is benefiting from subsurface water flow, enrichment from the upper slopes, right? Which that water is enriched with both oxygen and nutrients. So it's just almost like hydroponics, right? Growing in those lower lying elevations without being stagnant water. When you get down in the flats, then it does not thrive. Nothing does really there because there's no oxygen in the water. But in that, just above that is exactly where they want to be. So I think white spruce is the most nutrient demanding of the spruces. So if you put it on an old field in a fully stocked plantation and it's sucking up all the nutrients at a high rate, it could just run out too. It could just be running out of nitrogen or running out of some cation that we're not certain of, that was just mined out from the century of growing potatoes up where you are, or hay, or just non-sustainable agriculture. So I mean, so maybe just old-fashioned fertilization would help some of those stands, but I think the better thing is to let them just harvest what products you can and let them revert to hardwoods, which are the natural forests on those fields anyway. They were probably mostly sugar maple, northern hardwood stands with scattered spruce trees.
Right. A comment on red maple.
Yeah.
On my property, it has a very serious pest.
Oh.
And it's yellow-bellied sapsuckers.
Oh, okay. So, really? Not
They
the
kill the tops. I mean, they
Really?
drill so many holes in the top 15 or 20 feet. And I think our property must be on a flyway, because I do go out in the spring and the fall and I shoot as many as I can with a 410 shotgun, because around my house in particular, they have killed European weeping white birch in my landscapes.
Huh.
They top all my European mountain ash ornamentals, and they're very hard on hemlocks in my apple
Hemlock,
orchard.
yeah.
Yeah. And
I didn't, I've never, I've
hemlocks
seen
don't
it.
seem to be discouraged, but the red maple, they die off. So I mostly use red
Really?
maple firewood because I'm
Sure.
out there doing my timber stand improvement work. So
I think of sapsucker bad on hemlock, as you say. Also basswood, if you have any basswood, they'll go right after the basswood and then to some degree yellow birch. But I've not seen it bad on yet red maple in any of our properties. I would notice it. So that maybe you are on just like you said, a sapsucker flyway. I've never heard of such a thing, but maybe there is.
well, we have a hemlock and maple, probably 50 or 70 acres on one portion of our property. And it is hard to keep a red maple alive.
Okay. All right. All right.
So,
Let me jump in. We have 1 or 2 minutes left. There is a question from Mike. If you are in heavily weevilled white pine regen, 1 to 2 inch DBH, 10-foot tall, is it possible with a closing canopy providing more shade for the white pine to recover and produce logs?
Okay, so you're heavily weevilled, which means the stand is not particularly dense, probably. That's hard to answer without actually seeing how badly weevilled they are and what the spacing is. So if you have dense white pine, and the dominant trees are all going to get weevilled for a while, and they will certainly recover. And you can do corrective pruning, which we have done in a very sort of intensive crop tree focus by taking off the weevilled leaders and all the lateral branches but one in the weevilled whorl, and then training that to produce the new leader. But we spray bifenthrin for the weevil now, at least on our planted pines, to try to prevent this. So certainly any crop tree thinning would be the wrong thing to do, Mike. So don't thin it. You're right to think that the stand closing back in will help. The trees will train each other. And if you've got like 1,000 trees per acre, remember you only need 50 at the end of the rotation. So it can look bad, right? If even with 50% of the trees getting clobbered, you only need 20% of them to come out relatively straight and you're good to go. So you can be patient there. I mean, the alternative is to start over with something else, and that's going to be very expensive. I'd try to go with what I had if I had pine regeneration.
Great. We could sneak in one quick question if
Go
anybody
ahead.
wants to jump in. Anybody else? Okay. Well, I know for a fact that Bob loves getting questions sent to him as well.
Yes.
Demonstrated by the survey that he asked for input about things he should write. That survey's still available. So
Yeah,
that's another
please
way.
go in and respond and fill in. I mean,
Yeah.
I've read it all, and I've got dozens of personal emails.
Great.
All very interesting.
Great. So it's I'm going to type in his email address here, and it's Bob Seymour at maine.edu. And let me get it out to the group here. And I encourage everybody to reach out. It's a great way to get in touch.
Yeah.
The survey is on our homepage, mainwoodlandowners.org. That will be up for a little while. I'm happy to hear, I'm excited to say that Bob got some good input. And so he's actually got a article coming up in April that's in response to one of the questions from the survey. So
Yeah.
it's working.
This, Jen, do you realize this is the 2-year anniversary of this
That's
concept?
true.
When we first started this in early COVID,
That's right.
nobody knew what the hell to do. So let's
Yep.
gather and have a call-in show. And here we are 2 years later.
Here we are. And I feel like it's one of your birthdays soon, right? Or am I wrong?
Jess is April 12th. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember
So-
she was talking about that.
Yeah, time to get out in your woodlots. The snow's melting rapidly here, and I think after Saturday here in the rain, it's going to be bare ground. So get out there, do some work.
Yeah.
All right, maybe not for up there in the county.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll do this again.
Yeah,
I'll get Bob in here, but
Okay.
once the warm weather gets really in stride, we'll be out in the field. So we'll let
Okay.
everybody know what's coming up. Okay, thank you so much. I
All
hope
right.
everyone has a great weekend.
thank you all.
All righty, bye-bye.
Bye.